Our speaker today is Andrew Gilbert, who is a graduate student in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. He was a speaker at an event we did in the spring on Pussy Riot, and we actually showed the documentary about the the group, and Andrew spoke sort of about giving us the context of this within his own framework. And so right after that presentation, I thought he just did a spectacular job, and so I approached him about coming back and doing sort of a follow-on. And I think it took him a while to find something really that would work for our region and that fell within his own interest as well. But I'm glad to have him back talking about Czech and Slovak cinema and Videophiles here in the US.
Thanks, Bart. First, I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank you to Bart for extending the invitation to speak here. This is a unique opportunity for me to speak to people outside of my home discipline, so I'm really interested to get a different perspective on this work. Please be gentle. So as Bart said, the title of my presentation today is Czech and Slovak Cinema Representations in American Home Video Culture. And before I get started, a couple things I want to lay out. One, I'm coming from kind of two disciplinary backgrounds. The first is women and gender studies, which spurs my interest in cultural analysis of different phenomena, particularly who is represented, who is not represented, and how those mechanics work. But I'm also coming from a concentration in film studies, film and media studies, which approaches these topics very differently than a crease department would, which is why I'm very interested to hear what people have to say. If anyone was expecting kind of in-depth analyses, textual analyses of the films, I'm sorry to disappoint. I won't be talking about that too much, but we can in the Q&A. Also, just to throw this out there, I don't speak Czech or Slovak, so if I butcher any of these names, please help me out. But to get started, this is kind of a basic overview of what I'll be talking about today, and I know this is going to be more informal, but I never met a tangent that I didn't enjoy, so I tried to set this out a little more systematically to keep me on track. First, I want to talk very briefly about my larger research project. Why am I talking about these subjects? They seem very specific, right? Czech cinema and home video culture. And then I would like to touch on some theoretical interventions that I am in the process of making. So those are, at this moment, incomplete, and that's why I'm very interested to hear what people have to say about them. Then I will briefly talk about sites of representation, really quickly, and then I'll move on to a brief history of specialty home video. I don't want to spend too much time giving an esoteric history lesson on DVD and Blu-ray culture, but I feel maybe it's a little necessary to scaffold some of the things that I'm talking about. And then I want to look at where Czech and Slovak cinema exists in the United States in terms of home video, and then I'll end on some observations and some questions. So with that, I'll start diving into it. So as a women and gender studies scholar, some of the larger research project that I'm looking at is I find home video cultures to be a very interesting and wide open site for historical, social, and cultural research. And I'm approaching this in the sense that I find a kind of a research gap in this area. Just recently, in the last couple of years, a lot of books and scholarly articles have been published on the subject of home video, but they mostly approach it from a business and technology side, whereas I'm more interested in kind of looking at social critical analyses of what is there within that culture, why is this important. But also, as a gender scholar, I'm very much interested in these questions of representation. Who is represented, who is absent? Can we in any way assess why without falling back on larger assumptions about bigotry or sexism or racism? Can we really find the mechanics? And one thing I want to throw out right now is what this project has forced me to do by singling in on the representation of a specific set of cultures in the United States. I've had to shift how I tackle this, because essentially I'm trying to comprehend and then talk about how an entire national culture is represented in one specific way, which would be Czech and Slovak culture. And that made it a little messy. So if there's some messiness here, I'm aware of it, and I look forward to any kind of feedback on that. So really briefly, coming from gender studies, questions of representation can usually be broken down into two questions. And I just want to throw this out there quickly. The first is the representations of bodies on screen, which would be what kind of roles, what kind of characters are within the films themselves, who is playing them, who is represented. I'm not so much interested in that question here today, but I think it's necessary to point out that is a way that this research could go. I'm more interested in the second one, which are representation of cultural producers. So filmmakers, screenwriters, producers, the filmmakers behind the films themselves. And the reason that is because as I get into more descriptions of home video culture, the filmmaker, the auteur, the author is paramount in this kind of world. So whereas other fields may look at films as representative of social, historical movements or realities, home video culture, especially specialty home video culture, is almost exclusively interested in the filmmaker as auteur. So that is what I'm interested in looking at. So a couple of the theoretical interventions that I'm making. The first is suggested by Peter Hames, who is kind of the leading scholar in Czech and Slovak cinema, published in the English language. Because there are plenty of works from Czech and Slovak critics and scholars. But Peter Hames, who's written two, I think, essential books on the subject, the Czechoslovak New Wave and Czech and Slovak Cinema Theme and Tradition. Some of the things that he suggests that have really shaped my research is, one, that the cultural region is too complicated for an American consumer market, that it necessitates an oversimplification. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as I go along. But basically, the languages are too complex. What is a Czech film? What is a Slovak film? And also the kind of influence of Moravia, Hungary, Austria, Germany. There are prominent Czech films in the German language. So how do we make this region legible to an American consumer market that is assumed to be ignorant to these kind of cultural specificities? So as much as I regret to say it, you and I are not the main target market for the Czech films as they're released in the United States. But Hames also brings up this point that the Czech New Wave, which, is everyone here familiar with kind of the Czech New Wave, the parameters? I can give a brief rundown. Yes, no? Well, basically, Czech New Wave is a period in the 1960s. It was largely kind of under the influence of FAMU, which was the major film and television school in Prague. And the filmmakers that emerged from it were considered kind of like radical, fresh. Their films were allowed to kind of exist because of the thaw period that was happening in Czechoslovakia at the time. And it's largely considered to have ended when the Prague Spring ended in 1968 with the Soviet invasion, kind of clamped down on what was happening. But this new wave has kind of given meaning to Czech identity as it's represented in cinema in the United States. And Hames suggests that the reason for that is it's a very kind of legible, understandable period. I will make some more claims in addition to that, but that the periods before and after the New Wave are much too diffuse. There's too much going on. It's not easily understandable. It's just kind of this one movement that we can talk about. Also, Hames introduces this, I think, a really useful theoretical position of what he calls the wall in the head, which is the critics in the Western world, particularly the English-speaking West, have this kind of problematic imaginary of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, in that the category of Eastern Europe is itself very kind of problematic and oversimplifies an entire section of the world. But that these ideas have largely kind of shaped and limited how Czech cinema and Slovak cinema is brought over into the United States. There's a couple other points he makes, but if there's any questions on that in the Q&A, I'll be happy to talk about that. And then moving on, I found Saba Mahmoud's work to be particularly salient in this field. And basically what Saba Mahmoud argues in this piece that I've cited up here is that, and she's talking specifically about Western feminism, but that in the English-speaking West, specifically the United Kingdom and the United States, liberal English-speaking Westerners have a tendency to see what they want to see in foreign nations, pulling out radicalism that corresponds to their own sense of liberalism. and either erasing or omitting any other kinds of dissent that don't really cohere with the Western political platform. And I think there's plenty of room to discuss this in how Czech cinema is understood. Specifically in the New Wave, it's kind of valorized for being radically dissenting against communism, against any kind of totalitarian regime, but anything that isn't immediately understandable as that is simply forgotten, not released in the United States, known only to experts such as ourselves, or is even considered to recapitulate the oppression that they are undergoing, which is a major part of Mahmoud's argument. If it's not legible as radical in the sense that American liberals want it to be, it's actually playing a part in subjugating itself, which is really fascinating when considering the political complexities of Czech and Slovak cinema. And a last theoretical framework that I find very useful is from Pierre Bourdieu, who Bourdieu argues, particularly in his famous work Distinction, that taste, specifically cultural taste, is an act of social distinction, which people use to distinguish themselves culturally, socially, intellectually from other groups of people. And what I have found is that where Czech cinema exists in the United States is largely being used by people that want to distinguish themselves from others outside of an academic context. The way Czech cinema is marketed is as this kind of elite, cosmopolitan set of tastes. So if you're familiar with Miloš Forman, you're kind of in the intelligentsia of American critical culture, which is fascinating to me. So, and I can talk more about these theorists and their platforms as we move along. But first I want to briefly talk about sites of representation. And the reason this is, and this is a question I look forward to any comments people have, is that one of the problems with my research is finding the boundaries to talk about it. Where do I leave something out? Where do I leave something in? And I'm not particularly comfortable with only talking about home video, but for the sake of parsimony, I can't talk about every single thing in the world, even though I would love to. But these are basically the sites where representation can happen when we're talking about cultural producers. And they all kind of dovetail into each other. So even though I'm only talking about home video, it's not really appropriate to separate it completely from these other worlds. I'll specifically mention some things regarding online streaming and piracy, because these are sites that also find a lot of Czech cinema. In fact, almost anything that's not available in the United States is available through piracy. So if you're looking for specific Czech films, but that's a whole other can of worms and a whole other discussion. But, excuse me. The reason I'm interested in home video, as I said, is I don't think there's a lot of social cultural analysis of it, but also home video is a unique way of materializing film. It actually becomes a commodified product that we can own as a DVD. And it doesn't dematerialize if suddenly the streaming rights go away, or it's sitting in a vault in Prague somewhere and no one even is interested in releasing it to an English-speaking audience. The DVDs kind of have this unique life of their own. And any questions about the specificities of these, I'd be happy to talk about. So quickly, I know we're all itching to get to some analyses of Czech culture, but I do want to talk about specialty home video and kind of where it comes from. Because in my mind, this is the root, historically and socially, of how Czech and Slovak culture and cinema is constructed in the United States. And in order to really understand that, we need to understand the markets and the companies that play a major part in doing that kind of work. So real quickly, specialty home video arose, or it comes out of the 1950s when specialty distributors emerged in the United States. And these were basically, these are the big four companies: Janus Films, Facets Films, New Yorker Films, and Kino Lorber. These companies emerged in the 1950s to kind of target a niche market that was emerging, where Hollywood studios in the United States, they controlled their own distribution. So there was no question that Disney was going to distribute Disney films, Warner Brothers would distribute Warner Brothers films, and they had these massive international distribution apparatus. So their films were going to get seen all over. But the question arose, what's going to happen to all of these other films that are not major studios or are coming from this newly emerging category in the English-speaking West of foreign films, which is this catch-all genre for anything not in English. And the companies that emerged were small, privately owned companies, most of them based out of New York. Facets is based out of Chicago. And they would go and buy the distribution rights of different kinds of films. They would go to film festivals in Europe. They would target independently produced avant-garde works, basically this catch-all category of anything that's not a mainstream studio film. But they didn't just release these films. They constructed them with a very specific consumer market in mind. And this is where Bordeaux comes in. They targeted specifically cosmopolitan, urban, elite, intellectual consumers. Whether that's true or not, I don't think matters as much as that is how the companies themselves thought of this market. So anything that was in a foreign language, would only appeal to sophisticated urbanites. And there's also a kind of practical logistic reason for this. Since these companies were operating on a smaller scale, they didn't have the finances to release these films in, say, Lawrence, Kansas. So they were limited to Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Miami, the major kind of cities. But then in the 1980s, when home video started to stabilize as a viable marketplace, these companies immediately jumped on board and created distribution arms of themselves for specifically home video. So yeah, here's just a summation. And one thing I wanted to point out, because this is kind of where Czech cinema ends up existing, is that this construction of an elite specialty taste is not all that specialty home video is, because we could also consider pornography, low-budget horror, exploitation, schlock. That stuff is also specialty, because it's not getting the wide distribution. But the people that go see those movies have been socially constructed as kind of low, vulgar, classless, whereas people that pay to see a Czech film in the United States are automatically bestowed with this kind of sophistication. And the citations here, these are two, I think, of some of the better works to come out on home video culture, and a lot of this work comes from Daniel Herbert in his book Videoland. He really does a good job of talking about the formation of these companies. So moving on from that history, where then does Czech cinema exist specifically within this, this little world that I've constructed? And it's actually quite simple. With very few exceptions, Czech cinema exists in the Criterion Collection, which is the specialty home video distribution arm of Janus Films, which is one of the oldest of the specialty distributors, and Facets Video. Now there are exceptions to this. Kim Stim has released like the films of Jan Svankmajer, mostly animation, and there are a couple other DVD companies that come and go, Waterbearer Films. A lot of them are always kind of folding. And there are only a few that have lasted literally through the decades since their inception. So the bulk of Czech and Slovak films are going to be released by these two companies. So with that, I want to look at specifically how these companies present these films. To kind of give some, I'll share my basic observations and analyses, and then we'll kind of move on to some more overarching questions. But Facets is a really interesting case, because Facets has kind of cornered the market on what we can problematically call Eastern European films. A lot of Hungarian cinema is released through Facets, like Belatar. But also a lot of the first Czech DVDs to be released in the United States come from this company. But what's interesting is that it's very difficult to get a handle on what films they have and have not released. Things are constantly going out of print. Some things exist on their website. If you click Czech Cinema, it'll list about 10, 15 films, and some of them are floating around in their website that you have to like dig for some reason. But what I was interested in is the range of films that they have available ranges from 1949 to 2006. So this is a quite diverse selection of, if we were talking about what Czech cinema is. They have more than one woman director, which is quite shocking in all honesty when looking at these companies, and multiple films by each of these women. So it's not just Daisies by Vera Chytilova, which has come to be the only Czech film directed by a woman that seems to get constant discursive circulation in the United States. But the styles that they have represented, clearly the New Wave is prominent, but also classic films from the 40s and 50s, documentaries, more experimental avant-garde works, as well as kind of cult genre films like Lemonade Joe, which doesn't get talked about that often in some of these discourses. So they really have this broad selection of films, if you can consider 19 films out of a century-long history of a film's or a nation's output. I don't know if this necessitates turning the camera off, but I have to speak a little critically about Facets. I don't mean to bash them, but I think this is important. Even though Facets has done this essential cultural work, their mission is to educate people about these films. Facets is notorious for being a terrible DVD company. If you search any kind of forum discussion, DVD reviews, particularly their release of Black Peter, Milos Forman's kind of debut film, most places tell you it's better off not watching the film than watching their version of it, because the transfer is so bad. And I've seen them, they are awful, and they're very expensive, usually $30 or $40 a DVD for just a film. I can get into specifics of this in the Q&A, but really, sometimes they project a beat-up 16mm print against the wall and then videotape that. So it begs the question, yes, these films are available, but who knows they exist? Who would find them outside of maybe specialists? And if anyone does any research, why would you buy these films? So it's kind of this catch-22 about the work. There's also very inconsistent availability and information about what these films are, including, and I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, inconsistent use of the languages that these films are actually in and the nation of origin. So the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia are sometimes used interchangeably, and sometimes films that are actually in Slovak are listed as Czech. This happens a lot. And it kind of creates this confusion about what is this region actually, what are these films. Let's just call them Czech New Wave because it's easier, right? So another observation I wanted to make specific to Facets is they often sell the film through a plot description, which is unique when I move on to talk about the Criterion Collection, that mostly sells the film through the idea of what it is, through its importance, its cultural capital. Whereas Facets, God bless them, they're trying to tell you why these films are important through a plot description, which is becoming more and more rare when talking about Czech cinema in the United States. I'll move on. So, the Criterion Collection, interestingly, is the complete opposite in many ways. One of the things that you'll notice immediately is they have more films in print than Facets, with 18 films currently available in DVD or Blu-ray form. They also link to their Hulu Plus page, which has several streaming-only films, like Juraj Herz's The Cremator, which is one of my favorite films, which is, I believe, in Slovak, but again, listed as Czech. Their films range from 1964 to 1970, so already we see this is a very specific range of films that they have available. They have one woman director, which is actually Vera Chytilova in her film Daisies, which was released by Facets first, and then they kind of re-released it. But their films are exclusively Czech New Wave, and even if we want to trouble what constitutes Czech New Wave, they are presenting all of their films in relationship to this period, which I think is pretty interesting. So when we look at some of their releases, in opposition to Facets, their website is very streamlined. Their whole distribution apparatus is very kind of sexy and enticing. They really have their stuff put together. There's consistent information and availability about what these films are, even though, again, they sometimes incorrectly associate a Slovak language film with the Czech language, most specifically Jan Kadar's Shop on Main Street, which most historians pinpoint as one of the most important Slovak language films of the period, but to them it's just another Czech New Wave film. Their company is also, if anyone's familiar with them, famous for their quality, their prestige, their cultural importance. And I didn't have time to really get into this as much as I would have liked to in this presentation, but when the Criterion Collection releases a film, it sparks a newly found interest in discourse in the film. So films can be rediscovered. Most famously last year, they released Markita Lazarova, the František Vlasel, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, film. And it sparked this whole kind of new conversation about, this is the greatest Czech film ever made, how have we been ignorant of its existence? All because they pushed their release of it. And as I said, they're selling the films through the idea of what the film is, not necessarily what the plot is. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my overall observations. So if I were to make some just kind of basic observations that if I were to publish this would require a little bit more citation and detail, but much of Czech cinema as it's represented in the United States is very masculine, in kind of leaning on these understandings of the auteur filmmaker as kind of the main cultural creator. There are some women represented, but they don't get the same kind of press or, I would say, prestige as a lot of the other male filmmakers do. Even though there is some diversity available in the Facets collection, even if we compare Facets to Criterion, most of Czech and Slovak cinema is understood exclusively as Czech New Wave, which is interesting. All of the films are somehow like the best or the most important or the most beloved. There's always some kind of descriptor marking these films as the most significant of their kind, which I find very curious. But also, there's this, and this is where I get into more of the kind of cultural formations, is that everything related to Czech and Slovak culture in the film world of home video is that everything is radical, subversive, satirical, surreal, they're political allegories, they're fables. This really kind of heightened sense of this radical dissidence that is embedded in anything loosely associated with Czech. And this exists beyond film, even in the essays and descriptions of these DVD releases that talk about Czech music, Czech literature, Czech culture, almost painting Czech people as all of these like super intellectual, radical political dissident poets. And we know that's an oversimplification of any national region, right? Not everyone falls into this one category. But that is alive and well in the culture surrounding these films. Also, band films are very heavily emphasized, specifically Jan Nemec's Report on the Party and the Guests. Like, it's almost like banned in its home country every time you talk about it, which that's maybe a whole other conversation, but plays into this role that this is really kind of the cutting edge of subversive cinema and subversive culture. And again, as I've already mentioned, in this kind of world, Czech cinema ceases to be any kind of personal or artistic representation or cultural representation, and it almost exists exclusively to appeal to intellectual, cosmopolitan taste of savvy American DVD consumers, which I think is a very kind of interesting process that happens. So to reiterate in a little bit more detail some of these theoretical implications that I found very interesting was, again, Peter Haim's kind of hypothesis on why certain films are absent and why certain films are constructed the way they are. And one of the main things that I find in the descriptions of these DVDs reiterates this point I already made, that this period is simply too complicated. The borders are shifting too often. Like I've mentioned, certain films that are Czech films are released in different languages, most famously Ecstasy, which was Hedy Lamar's kind of big break, is a German language film, but a Czech film. And also A Shop on Main Street, which is the Czech New Wave film, but it's actually in the Slovak language. So these kinds of complexities don't translate well, or aren't perceived to translate well by the gatekeepers of these films, the people who hold the rights. And I find it interesting to consider, if we're going to use this problematic cultural construction of Eastern Europe, is it shares more in common with social constructions of third world cinema in the United States. So where the entire continent of Africa is just African cinema, the entire continent of South America is just Latin American cinema, all of Southeast Asia that's not China or Japan, it's just Asian cinema. And while I don't have any answers, what I am interested in investigating is why is it that some of these quite important European nations are not considered in the same vein that, say, Germany or France is. Because if we really want to break it down, the history of Germany and France are just as complicated as any other nation on the continent, but for some reason they're kind of given this streamlined, oversimplified kind of understanding. Sorry. Another thing I forgot to mention is also the translations of the titles are also largely inconsistent. And if I were to expand this study to look at DVDs out of the United Kingdom, which in my own work outside of this I'm doing, Peter Haynes writes the liner notes for most British DVDs that are Czech films. There's a largely inconsistent use of titles. So Loves of a Blonde is also translated as A Blonde in Love. There's a debate over whether it's Closely Watched Trains or Closely Observed Trains. And not speaking Czech, I can't really speak to the nuances of this, but I'm wondering almost if this kind of inconsistency of what can be translated also makes these films difficult to kind of bring to an American consumer. What are these films? How do I even look them up in Google? And going back to Mahmoud, what we see here is certain filmmakers, specific films in the Czech New Wave are really kind of valorized for resisting what's seen as this kind of oppressive Soviet influence. And what this does is it really kind of erases other forms of representation, other forms of agency, other forms of resistance in Czech and Slovak culture. For instance, almost anything that existed during the Protectorate, during World War II, is often considered to have been capitulating its own oppression. And one of the most interesting examples of this is, I always say the name incorrectly, Otakar Vávra, who some people consider the spiritual godfather of the Czech New Wave, and I'm quoting, some call him an opportunist sleazeball. So it becomes really complicated when you have a lot of Czech and Slovak filmmakers have been making films under multiple different forms of government. They were making films before the Nazi Protectorate, during the Nazi Protectorate, after World War II, during the Soviet invasion, during the thaw. And it becomes, how do we talk about the politics of these filmmakers if we can't understand them in a coherent, stable narrative, like we do with people like Milos Forman or Ivan Passer, who eventually left their homeland to become celebrated Hollywood filmmakers. But also I found, using Mahmoud as a lens, certain complexities are completely erased, like Yuri Menzel, who after the Soviet invasion of Prague denounced all of his contemporaries, including filmmakers like Vera Chitolova and Jan Nemec, who he had made films with, as being extravagant, too liberal, too experimental, and made only state-sanctioned films. That's not really talked about as much in the United States. Only Closely Watched Trains and his kind of like radical subversive politics before the Soviet invasion. And kind of the final point that does need a little bit more fleshing out is I would like to make some connections between Mahmoud's theoretical framework in constructing these films as complementing American sensibilities, but how those sensibilities also become forms of taste markers. So if I were to go to some cinephile forum and talk about Czech cinema, I'm clearly a sophisticated person, and I've already mentioned this, right? But Bordeaux seems particularly apt to kind of fleshing out those arguments, because when we look at how Czech cinema is represented in the United States, it's really kind of appealing to that viewer. Which is interesting, and this is a problem with foreign films as a category in the United States anyway, because as we know, any culture, but here we'll specifically talk about Eastern European cultures, not all of their films are politically or artistically minded, right? They have genre films, they make, especially in Czech, there are so many just genre science fiction films. They really kind of pioneered the genre of science fiction. None of those have kind of an audience in the United States. And I'm wondering if it is because films like Ikari XP1 is kind of embodying certain Soviet aspirations of a kind of global society that is moving forward in the future. And that doesn't really gel with this kind of radical rejection of anything even loosely associated with socialism or communism.